The idea of human rights, as we understand it today, emerged out of the turmoil and horror and atrocities of the Second World War. Shortly after the war, in 1948, the United Nations adopted the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And I should point out that the chairperson of the committee that drafted this declaration was Eleanor Roosevelt, whom we've seen several times in our course thus far, each time advocating for or supporting the rights of marginalized people. UC San Diego honors the work of Eleanor Roosevelt by having one of its undergraduate colleges named after her. This is Eleanor Roosevelt College. And Eleanor Roosevelt College was formerly known as Fifth College because it was the fifth of UCSD's undergraduate college before the emergence of Sixth College. And of course, now we also have Seventh, and in a few years we will also have Eighth. Now, one day, perhaps Sixth College will obtain a name. How does Judy Heumann College sound to you? The idea behind the Universal Declaration was that there were fundamental rights inherent to all human beings that no state could violate. That these are the basic rights that every human being is entitled to, regardless of any identity category. That all nations must adhere to these equal and inalienable rights of all members of the human family as the foundation of freedom, justice, and peace in the world. And that each individual was the subject of global concern. Article 1 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights states that all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. This is aspirational, what we could hope to manifest as a global community, that these rights and respect for dignity of all people could serve as a foundation of peace and good governance. Article 2 offered a non-discrimination provision, and it's there to protect minority communities who are at risk for discriminatory treatment by majority societies. And it states, everyone is entitled to all the rights and freedoms set forth in this declaration without distinction of any kind, such as race, color, sex, language, religion, political or other opinion, national or social origin, property, birth, or other status. But in the decades following the establishment of the Universal Declaration, as we've seen in our course, disability organizations and advocacy increased to press for social and political change, raising awareness of disability as a distinct category that had been previously overlooked by the framers of the Declaration. Now, Article 2 does not exclude people with disabilities, but since people with disabilities had been historically marginalized or hidden, there needed to be something that specifically addressed this community, showing that their human rights mattered too. The UN then adopted resolutions, issuing a declaration in 1971 on the rights of mentally retarded persons, and then in 1975 on the rights of disabled persons. Though both of these still relied on the medical model of definition, and they recognized the rights only, and I quote, to the maximum degree of feasibility. The UN proclaimed 1981 the International Year of Disabled Persons to address, and I quote, their deplorable conditions owing to the presence of physical and social barriers which prevent their integration and full participation in the community. As a result, millions of children and adults throughout the world are segregated and deprived of virtually all their rights and lead a wretched, marginal life, end quote. And then they marked the decade from 1983 through 1992 as the Decade of Disabled Persons. And then remember that this overlaps with the work done domestically that led up to the passing of the Americans with Disabilities Act in 1990. And in 1991, the UN adopted principles on the protection of persons with mental illness and the improvement of mental health care. And this is the Principles for the Protection of Persons with Mental Illness. Disability organizations wanted something even stronger than these declarations. They wanted an international convention, a treaty that nations would sign onto on the rights of all people with disabilities. In 2001, Mexico sponsored a UN resolution for this, which led to the creation of an ad hoc committee, which eventually produced the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, the CRPD, adopted in 2006, and it began implementation in 2008. The CRPD is a human rights treaty now signed by 164 nations. And for these nations, this is binding in international law. Although who will enforce a treaty or take action if violations occurred, okay, some of that's uncertain. And the U.S. signed the convention, but the U.S. Senate has yet to ratify this treaty. The CRPD reflects an important paradigm shift. It was built on the advocacy that we've seen in this course, shifting away from the medical model, from viewing disability as the source of the problem, to address society's attitudes toward people with disabilities, the barriers that are the source of the problem. And this calls for a collective effort to remove those barriers that deprive people with disabilities of access, it hinders opportunities, and it continues to exclude. And so the treaty rejected the medical model of defining disability that was in the earlier declarations of the 1970s and 1991 to recognize the social dimension of disability, the stigma, the physical and social barriers. In fact, this is evident in the very first article of the CRPD and its inclusive description of people with disabilities. Persons with disabilities include those who have long-term physical, mental, intellectual, or sensory impairments, which in interaction with various barriers may hinder their full and effective participation in society on an equal basis with others. So here's a social understanding of disability. The CRPD contains articles stating the substantive rights protected by the Convention. It doesn't offer any new rights, but rather clarifies the obligation and legal duties of states to respect and ensure the equal enjoyment of all human rights by all persons with disabilities. And these include, as you see here, access to education, equality and non-discrimination, equal recognition before the law, the right to life, liberty and security, freedom from cruel, inhuman, degrading treatment, liberty of movement and nationality, freedom of expression and opinion, the right to medical care and health and employment, participation in public life, and participation in cultural life, in recreation, and leisure, and sport. And again, look through these and think about how long the process of advocacy, the fight for equality, how long that journey had been, and how that is reflected in this declaration. Now, one important note to make here is that the CRPD was developed in collaboration with people with disabilities who played a prominent role in its drafting. The ad hoc committee listened to 400 representatives of organizations from more than 40 countries, many of which worked together as the International Disability Caucus, which was advised by disability scholars and activists. And it's been estimated that 80% of the final text of the convention was drafted, in fact, by the International Disability Caucus. So the CRPD is a landmark achievement for disability advocacy and human rights, and it builds on the work that we've explored in this course, which is one part of a global movement for justice. And these declarations may be aspirational, as law often is, but at least it makes clear to that standard to which we as a global community should all aspire.